Well, you're probably noticing that I'm giving you a lot of detailed information, and that's going to continue in this lesson. That's because we are dealing with so much change. And in fact, all the 19th century, whenever you look at its history, whether you're in the United States or in Europe, for example, you will often find change. Things are happening rapidly. Things are moving quickly. And sometimes the only way to kind of even evaluate the change is to write down a few key statistics or a few key facts. Now, of course, we're going to interpret all this through our moral philosophy, through the whole idea of a principle. But all the same, your hand might grow a little cramped today as you try to jot these all down. Of course, you can pause the video and take your time on these things. But I want you to keep track of these details. Even though you're going to have to remember all of them, you need to be able to have an idea of how things change. So don't worry about trying to memorize all these facts. Just make certain that you have an understanding of how they flow. But in order to do that, you need to write them down. Now, for the beginning of this lesson, we're going to take a look at how technology was changing, how that was actually developing and expanding and went hand in hand with the settlement of the frontier. So we'll begin with the character of James Smithson. Now, Smithson was a British chemist who amassed a large fortune. In fact, he was able to donate some $500,000 to the United States government upon his death. And he had one requirement for this. He wanted there to be a great museum to all the sciences, to all of the arts established in the capital of Washington, D.C., much along the lines of, say, what John Quincy Adams had dreamed of. And so, the Smithsonian was established based upon these initial funds, and it's become really our greatest of museums. Well, what the Smithsonian did in terms of the frontier during this day and age of the early 19th century was it was the institution that published all of that detailed information on the frontier. Everything from the water conditions to the condition of nutrients in the soil to geology to weather reports. All of these things that sometimes seem mundane, but are incredibly useful information if you are planning a new home in a foreign land, which the frontier was. Another thing that happened at this time was the steel plow was invented. Because it was made of steel, it would not break as easily when it hit a rock during the process of plowing. Another innovation about this particular plow was that it broke the prairie grass on those great vast tracts of land in the West where you could grow significant amounts of wheat. It broke those grasses while it was plowing. So you didn't have to break the grass and then come back and plow several times over it. This steel plow was invented by an inventor named John Deere. And John Deere also had the idea of what would it look like if I franchised my business and established John Deere dealerships throughout all of the major cities. He did this, it built a huge business, which of course is still heavily used by farmers and others to this day. But that steel plow really allowed the expansion to occur. Another great innovator at the time was a man by the name of Cyrus McCormick, and he invented a mass reaper machine. And this reaper machine was able to harvest. It was able to cut and collect whatever you had grown in your fields in a rapid measure. In fact, his reaper could actually cut an entire acre of oats in only 20 minutes by the use of a single person. And so it made it so that all this massive land that was being plowed quickly, thanks to the steel plow, which was very efficient, and then was growing incredible amounts of food, thanks to the richness of the soil itself, was then able to be harvested rapidly. Otherwise, if you couldn't harvest it that rapidly, you actually risked running out of time to harvest everything, and you would actually see a lot of the food begin to wilt or even decay and rot in the field itself. And so all of these various innovations help to increase production. In fact, they increase production by about 6 to 8 bushels of food per acre. All of this excess, because it couldn't all be sold here in the United States, was then shipped abroad, much of it to Europe, who began to heavily consume all of our products. It added an incredible amount of wealth to the American states, particularly to the farmers of the American states. And these farmers were always looking for further innovations. In fact, United States farmers were some of the first to use steam power in the various machines on their farms. In fact, steam power became common during this time. It was very common to go into factories such as the sawmills or the cotton mills and see steam engines at work. In fact, 50% of all of our factories began to use steam power. If they didn't use steam power, it was because they were near some great river or some great waterfall, which would turn a great turbine, which provided energy to run all the machines of the plant. But this saw a time of incredible invention, of incredible innovation. I'll give you an example. The U.S. Patent Office is a place that you apply to if you have some idea that you want to be patented, you want to be protected, you have an invention, you don't want anybody else to use it without your permission. And so you apply for a patent for some invention, some technology, some machine, and if it is proven to be unique, the U.S. Patent Office will give it to you. Well, in the year 1811, towards the beginning of the century, there were only an average of 77 patents actually applied for each and every year. So it tells you it was a rather small numbers of innovations that were being developed at this time. By the year 1850, only a generation later, there was on average 28,000 patents being applied for at the U.S. Patent Office every single year. That is a fact that you need to really mull over because it shows you an incredible development in technology, an incredible development in innovation, but especially in opportunity. Because people will realize that if they had a brilliant idea, they could patent it, they could then sell that idea or sell products based upon that idea, and it would often provide them with incredible fortunes and would often be a great assistance to others. Of course, as we've seen with agrarianism and mercantilism, the way you treat technology often determines success. If technology is just there as an end in of itself and it's just there to produce more quantity of goods, then it really doesn't improve life. But if technology is seen as a tool to build the kingdom, if it's seen as a means to actually improve the quality of life itself, then it really has an intense value. Well, one of the most controversial aspects we're going to take a look at right now in terms of technological growth was how slavery was affected. It's interesting, slavery, which we'll talk in greater details at a later time, was something that was almost beginning to diminish in the early 19th century in the U.S. In fact, in the year 1808, the U.S. Congress had outlawed the slave trade internationally. That meant that no new slaves could be brought into the country, nor could slaves be exported out of the country. This actually followed in 1803 when all the states had done the same law. They'd all passed the same idea and the same bill. Well, what occurred to change the way that slaves were treated or the way that slaves were seen as property was the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1794. The cotton gin provided a machine that could quickly take the seeds out of cotton. Prior to this, you had to manually remove the seeds, and then the way that you had to process cotton to turn it into thread and then turn it into cloth itself took a single man some 12 days to produce a standard amount of cotton cloth. And so the cotton gin, along with machines like the spinning jenny, for example, increased the amount of efficiency. It made it much faster. In fact, it made it 50 times faster, so that a man could produce it in a 50th of 12 days. That meant that if you had fields, such as the South had, that could easily grow this cotton product and then provide cotton goods to the world, you had an incredible opportunity for wealth. But you still need somebody to work these fields, and you need somebody to actually pick the cotton itself, and that is where the slave labor came in. Before we look at that even further, we understand how attractive cotton was. So one of the attractive things about cotton is that cotton is fairly lightweight. So in a warm climate, you can wear cotton and it'll keep you much cooler than, say, wool. However, if you're in a rather cold climate where things are fairly icy, during the winter especially, you can layer that cotton and it will keep you warm as well. The other thing about cotton is that cotton naturally keeps away diseases better than wool. And so people began to realize that cotton was a highly desirable product. But because in the early days it took so long to produce, it was highly expensive. However, things like the cotton gin, things like the southern plantations, and things like the spinning jenny caused the price of cotton to drop to a mere 1% of its original price by the year 1860. Britain, that great economy in the world, alone would import 1 billion pounds of U.S. cotton every year, especially by the 1860s, and over 90% of that cotton came from southern states alone. As a result, slaves who were seen as necessary to the harvesting and production of this cotton were suddenly more desirable themselves, and the price of a single slave grew from about $50 per slave in the early 1800s to $1,000 per slave by 1860. As a result, mercantilism began to take over in many places, and plantations sprang up that would often produce massive amounts of cotton, would often deplete all the nutrients of the soil in a single area, often with harsh practices and harsh treatment of all of their animals and all of their workers and all of their slaves, and then move on to another plot of land to perform the same thing for the next few years until all of that area had been depleted as well. To make matters worse, slaves began to be seen as mere property. Now, they had always been seen as property in a way or another prior to this, but there's something about this incredible opportunity that went along with greed and created the view of slaves as being almost like animals. In fact, some plantation owners were known to breed their slaves and then deliberately break up families and sell those people on because it made them more money. Now, that wasn't the role of every slave owner by far, nor was it the way that the South typically viewed slavery, but the point is this: it did actually occur, and we can't look honestly at this time of our history without understanding that very fact. Now, before we end this lesson, I want to take a look at one more aspect of change, and that was the aspect of transportation, the way that we got around from place to place. Things such as the National Road, or sometimes called the National Pike, sprung up during this time. It would stretch over 800 miles from the East Coast all the way to the Midwest, and it was said to have beautiful stone bridges and archways with iron mileposts and gorgeously worked iron gates. It was an incredible feat of engineering that also provided a swift way for people to travel from the East Coast into those interior farms of the Midwest. But there were other forms of transportation that increased, such as the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal, which was finally completed in the year 1825, was able to link the Great Lakes through a series of locks and dams where a ship would go into a chamber and it would either rise or lower based upon how they let in the water. And then they could travel along the canal, which stretched across New York State, all the way to the Hudson River, and then from the Hudson they could get down into the Atlantic. That meant that those on those farms in the Midwest could put their goods on a ship that would go through the Erie Canal, and it could get to the Atlantic and eventually over to Europe. So it made possible rapid transportation of goods as well as rapid transportation of people. It reduced the time of travel between all cities. To make things even better than that, there was the advent of steamboats, those great steamships that appeared in all the rivers, especially the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. For example, it used to take 100 days to travel from Pittsburgh all the way down to New Orleans by river. The steamboat cut that time into a third. It only took about a month, which still seems like a long time to us moderns, but was an incredible advent back then to travel that distance. This was followed by various stagecoaches. It was followed by the advent of things like the Santa Fe Trail, which saw some 75,000 oxen and 6,000 wagons pass every single year. It was followed by things like the Pony Express, which was able to get a letter from Missouri to California in only 10 days. Or things such as the telegraph machine, which by 1844, when it first was invented, quickly passed along messages. In fact, by 1861, telegraph lines stretched from Missouri to California, which made message passing instantaneous. And of course, this was even followed by the railroads, which made travel and the passage of goods and people even faster. Now, that's a lot of information, but the whole point is this: all of these innovations, when they were correctly used, helped to expand proper dominion. When they were not properly used, they actually expanded sin. They actually expanded the fallen world. But still, the whole point that we always have to ask ourselves is the technologies that we have, the resources that we have been given and blessed with, how are we actually going to use those? Are we actually going to use those to build a kingdom that goes beyond us and even this world? Or are we going to use them for selfish ends? Of course, we look at that with America's history and we see a picture of both. What I want you to notice in this lesson is it comes back in many ways to those common farmers who, when they had that foremost institution of religion, that caused a remarkable expansion and a remarkable creation of independence in early American history.